All right. Today we are jumping into one of the most unconventional scientific papers you will probably ever hear about. It tries to connect a lost continent in Antarctica, the origin of Neanderthals, modern diseases, and some pretty startling predictions about our future after COVID. It is a wild ride. So let's break down exactly what it claims. Okay, so here's how we're going to unpack this whole thing. We'll start with its pretty radical idea about where humans came from, think Antarctica. Then we'll see how it connects that idea to ancient civilizations. After that, we'll dig into the biological evidence the paper claims to have, look at the microscopic engine it says is driving everything, and finally, we'll get to its really bold predictions for where humanity is headed. So right out of the gate, the paper hits you with this massive question. It basically challenges the entire mainstream story of our origins, the one we all learned in school. It's proposing that a huge branch of our family tree, the Neanderthals, came from somewhere completely different. Now, this entire theory, this whole house of cards, really rests on one single, very controversial idea, that there was a prehistoric supercontinent that has long since disappeared. The paper gives this lost landmass a name, Lemuria. Now, to be clear, this was a real but now discredited hypothesis from the 19th century. Geologists came up with it to explain why they were finding similar fossils across different oceans. Mainstream science, of course, replaced this idea with plate tectonics a long time ago. But this paper, it dusts off Lemuria and puts it right at the heart of Neanderthal evolution. So, according to this hypothesis, Lemuria was this absolute beast of a continent. It connected what we now know as India, Antarctica, Australia, South America, and Africa. The author argues that this one giant landmass was the perfect isolated stage for a totally unique evolutionary story to play out. And here it is, the central claim, the bombshell. The paper argues that Neanderthals are not some Eurasian offshoot of hominids that came out of Africa. No. Instead, it says they are a completely separate lineage that evolved all on its own on Lemuria, specifically around the area of modern-day Antarctica, way before they ever set foot in Europe or Asia. So, okay, if Neanderthals started way down south, how in the world did they end up shaping ancient history up in the north? Well, the paper suggests it was all thanks to a series of world-changing catastrophes. The theory goes like this. As Lemuria began to break apart, cataclysmic recurring tsunamis forced these Antarctic Neanderthals to flee north. So they weren't just migrating, they were essentially refugees, and they carried their unique culture and their genes to places like the Indus Valley, ancient Sumeria, and even the Basque Country in Europe. And this is where the paper tries to connect the dots to the rise of ancient civilizations. It argues that some of the key features of societies like Harappa and Sumeria, things like being matrilineal, female-led, and using symbolic languages like hieroglyphs, were actually cultural fingerprints left behind by these Neanderthal migrants. This quote right here really captures the most stunning claim of all, that Neanderthals never really went extinct. Instead, the paper argues they just assimilated, becoming the foundational layer, the substratum for all the civilizations that would later take over the ancient world. All right, the next piece of this giant puzzle is how the theory tries to connect this grand story about history to modern medicine. And it does this by focusing on a handful of very specific, localized diseases. The paper zooms in on a pretty rare heart condition called endomyocardial fibrosis, or EMF. And here's the crucial part. EMF is mostly found in regions that were supposedly part of that ancient Lemurian continent, places like South India, parts of Africa, and South America. The paper sees this as a huge biological clue, not just some random coincidence. And here you have it, the core of the medical evidence presented in the paper. The author claims that in small groups of patients, a very high percentage of people with these specific diseases also showed physical traits that the paper identifies as Neanderthal-like. I mean, look at these numbers. They're reporting over 70% for patients with EMF and for a sample of individuals with autism. The conclusion drawn is that these conditions are somehow activating a dormant Neanderthal ancestry inside us. So what on earth could possibly connect a lost continent, Neanderthal genes, and modern heart disease in Kerala, India? The paper proposes a single microscopic agent as the master controller behind it all. Okay, this slide basically lays out the biochemical engine for the entire theory. Let's walk through it. First, there's this weird microbe called archaea, which the paper says loves to hang out in radioactive beach sands of former Lemurian coastlines. Second, these microbes produce a toxin. Third, that toxin is linked to diseases like EMF. And finally, the paper proposes this whole chain reaction can actually flip a switch in our bodies, reactivating ancient Neanderthal genes and causing those physical traits. It's quite a chain of. This brings us to the final, and I've got to say by far the most speculative part of the theory. The paper takes this ancient biological mechanism and argues that it is not only active today, but it is being massively accelerated, pushing humanity toward its next evolutionary leap. So the final argument is that modern stressors, we're talking global warming, electromagnetic fields from the internet, and yes, even the COVID-19 pandemic, are all acting as evolutionary triggers. The theory claims these forces are putting that archaea-driven engine into overdrive, forcing a rapid, species-level change on all of us. And this timeline here, this lays out the predicted endgame. The claim is that we are literally witnessing the end of Homo sapiens. We're being replaced by a new species the paper calls Homo neanderthalis. And the forecast doesn't stop there. It predicts the eventual rise of Homo roboticus, and then finally, Homo galacticus, a species that can colonize space. And just to ground this for a second, these science fiction-level predictions, they weren't made decades ago. This paper was published in August of 2021, putting its wild evolutionary forecast squarely in our present day. And that's our look at this truly remarkable paper. It tries to stitch together geology, anthropology, and futurism. And it leaves us with a final, pretty unsettling question based on its whole premise. What if our future was being dictated by a microscopic biological script written on a lost continent millions of years ago?